Wide receiver Gabe Davis is a free agent. Should the Bills be interested? We're going to discuss that in rounds 4 through 7 of the 2025 draft this week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo Fanbase Podcast Network. My name is Justin, and I am your host. And just off the top here, want to give a little apology for the delay on this week's episode. Something I don't talk about on this show a ton, you may or may not know. I am currently a college student, and this week happens to be the last week of the semester, gearing up for finals week, all that good jazz. So the schedule is pretty wonky probably this week and next, just as we're wrapping up the semester. So I appreciate your grace with that. Good news is if you hit that subscribe button, you're not going to miss any of the episodes. So go ahead and hit that button. This week, a couple things we want to talk about, and we still have to get into the second half of the Bills draft here, rounds 4 through 7. And we also have another kind of newsy item, which they keep kind of falling in our laps here. Hopefully this continues all throughout the offseason, because we go through some patches where there's not much news and got to get really creative on what we're doing with content to keep quality shows coming out. But if stuff like this keeps falling on our laps, I'm all for it through the off season. And that bit of news, as you probably guessed, is the Jacksonville Jaguars have released wide receiver Gabe Davis. After just 1 year on the team, he played 10 games. He signed a 3-year, $39 million contract. I think it was $24 million of that guaranteed. And just 1 year into that, they have cut ties. And, the immediate reaction is, should the Bills bring him back? And I think this is a good discussion to have, for a multitude of reasons. Number one being, regardless of what you feel about Gabe Davis, the Bills organization always talked very highly of Gabe Davis. Always very complimentary things to say about, who he is in the locker room, having that right DNA, being the hardest working guy on the team, all that kind of messaging that you always heard, top to bottom with the organization. They love this dude, and they don't care what you think about him. The other thing being the propensity of this organization to bring back players that were on the team, that know the scheme, that know the locker room, that know the culture. And we see it this year with Dane Jackson and Trey White. There was other cornerback options out there, and they really took their time on that. They were comfortable bringing back, some former guys. You look to previous years, Jordan Phillips, Shaq Lawson, the list goes on and on. They love bringing in people that have familiarity with the team, how everything works here, what the locker room's like, all that stuff that I just touched on. So do I think the Bills should do it? And this is, the Justin opinion, for whatever that's worth. I have a hard time saying yes here, despite parts of me wanting to say yes. And I think the big reason that I would say no here is just kind of the logistics of what still exists. If this was maybe a few more years down the road and, we got back to the point where for Gabe Davis to be comfortable continuing a career in the NFL, he was accepting a role of, a wide receiver 4 or 5 type deal and coming in on a very low contract. I think it would make more sense there if this happened before the Bills signed Elijah Moore. I think it would make more sense. And, Elijah Moore coming in on a 1-year contract up to $5 million, whatever. It's not any guarantee of being on the roster. It doesn't preclude you from making a different move. But I think they kind of diagnosed where they wanted to go with that, and it was kind of a different direction. And then we look at all the wide receivers on this team right now. I'm just not sure that it makes a ton of sense. I think part of the reason for leaving Buffalo in the first place was kind of on the organization. We, in my opinion, over promoted Gabe Davis. He had these expectations as a wide receiver too, coming off that 4-touchdown Kansas City playoff game. And it was kind of unrealistic expectations that set him up to come up short. And, we're only going into 2 years removed from that Kansas City tape. I think there's a certain level of the conversation of he does still have that guaranteed money coming from Jacksonville. So maybe he's more willing to take a lower deal in a spot that he thinks makes more sense for him. At the same time, I do think there's going to be a team that sees the flashes and has more room for him to compete for a more meaningful role, and with that coming bigger money. So all those things said, I don't think there's a ton of reasons why it would make sense for both the Bills and Gabe Davis. Like I said at the beginning of this, you're getting my opinion. That's not worth a ton for what these conversations mean organizationally for these players. I don't have inside sources, all that stuff. This is just me sitting here with my thoughts. All of those thoughts being said, if I get a push notification in the next day, 2 weeks, whatever, that the Bills are bringing back Gabe Davis to compete for a spot on the roster, I will not be the least bit surprised. I think there's a myriad of factors that point to why it could happen. Whether or not I think it should is a different conversation. So that's the Gabe Davis conversation. I'm sure we'll be having more conversations to do with this in the coming weeks. I don't think this is going to be a quick and easy one. But getting into the remainder of the Bills 2025 draft class, we broke down rounds 1 through 3 in last week's episode. If you're interested in my thoughts on that and you haven't gotten those, hit pause now. Go back to last week's episode where we break down Max Hairston, TJ Sanders, and Landon Jackson. And this week I want to look at rounds 4 through 7. And that obviously starting with a big pick, both literally and metaphorically, in the 4th round with Deone Walker. Bills trading up to get a guy that they wanted to target, and herein lies the double dip that I was hoping that we got at defensive tackle. And we can talk about different names and situations and whatnot that would lead us to the double dip at defensive tackle. But if you've been listening to the show for any meaningful amount of time, you know that I wanted a meaningful double dip at defensive tackle. And I do think that you got that. I think picking Max Hairston in the 1st round makes a ton of sense. There were options at defensive tackle that made sense, but they were going fast in the 1st round. And I don't think there's a path where it made sense to trade up in the draft to get one of those guys. And you know that I was a big fan of Kenneth Grant, Derek Harmon. I think it made a lot more sense to explore the depth of this class and maybe get some value later in the draft. You've heard me talk about, I think there is room for it to make sense for us to trade down in the 1st round. I still think there was a path to that. with kind of how the cornerback board was falling. But all that being said, 4th round pick, Deone Walker. And this guy comes in as the massive human that a lot of people wanted to draft, albeit a different type of player. You see 6'7", 331, probably played his college ball at every bit of 350. And, you think, here it is. This is our space eating guy to free up the linebackers, all that stuff. Well, not really his play style. He's much more of a penetration style guy. And, a lot of the comps out there are from a Bills player that we're very familiar with in Jordan Phillips. And I say that with both the good and the bad of this player. And on the good side of things, I think this is one of those aiming high swings for the Bills when we get into the later rounds, and that you see this massive human being with a really impressive athletic profile, and those guys don't typically make it to the 4th round. Some questionable tape in 2024 comes out during the draft process. He's been dealing with a back injury. All kinds of concerns there for for myself. You see this giant human. You're using your back for, a ton of leverage in the trenches. What's the long-term prognosis here? What can we expect? And, you see some of the knocks on his game for being that size and that level athlete, playing with, tall pads, kind of losing leverage battles, and kind of the exact criticisms I've had of Jordan Phillips in the past of, you see a guy that size and you expect him to be stout and run coverage, and you flip on the film and you see him get kind of blown off the ball a good amount of times, more than you'd like to see for that size. I think the upside here, and you've heard Brandon Bean talk about, if he thinks he comes out after the 2023 season, there's a chance that that's a 1st round pick, maybe 2nd round guy, and you're able to get him here in the 4th. You hope that with the strength and conditioning and all the fancy facilities we have in Buffalo, the fact that he's going to be in a rotation, kind of limiting his snaps, you were able to take TJ Sanders in the 1st round. You added to the position group. Maybe you can kind of slow roll him in his 1st season, get that back right, and hopefully you get. This is the type of pick that has the potential to be like the steal of the draft. Not to get too hyperbolic, but the athleticism at that size, being able to get after the pass rusher, I think the ceiling here is super high. I think the issue that you could have here is the floor might be a little bit shaky footing. You want to know exactly what you're getting in the floor, and this could end up being a guy that can never really figure out how to fully deal with the back injury and ends up being a throwaway pick. So for me, this is my biggest boomer bust draft pick that we have in this class. I think there's a ton of players that are pretty clean projections to knowing exactly what you're getting. But I look at this one as, if you're able to even like scratch at that ceiling, I think about some pass rush packages when you have Groot on one side, Joey Bosa on the other, and then you slap Ed Oliver in there, penetrating 3-tech, and Deone Walker penetrating 3-tech that at that size and that athleticism might require you to throw 2 guys at him. You give Groot, Bosa, Ed Oliver, even if you want to get into some of these other draft picks in Landon Jackson, TJ Sanders, Ogunjobi when he's back in from the suspension, Michael Hoyt in the mix. I think you have a lot of versatility in people that are going to get after the pass rusher. And I think the Bills showed very clearly with this draft pick for any of us wanting that run stuffing D tackle that just eats up blocks. It's not a priority of this organization right now. They have compression style defensive ends that are going to, kind of collapse the pocket, and they want their D tackles to get up the field and get pressure right in the quarterback's face. And I think you made good moves to lean into that. Next pickup was Jordan Hancock in the 5th out of Ohio State. And this is a pick that I really enjoy for some of the versatility that you bring to the table. And I think this is day one competition for Cam Lewis on the roster. I think he provides more pedigree, more athleticism, youth at the position. And I think Cam Lewis has been good in his role for the Bills. But when you look at all of the things that he's asked to do between, we've seen him in on dime packages. We've seen him in as Taron Johnson's backup. We've seen him play some backup safety. I think that I think he can come in and be depth competition and project as a possible replacement in some of these roles. And I think you can look at him as a guy that could contribute on special teams, maybe like a Saron Neal, maybe a Cam Lewis, maybe kind of a combo there. But I'm also looking at the long-term options here of a guy like Taron Johnson isn't getting any younger, and that's a very hard conversation for me to have. Taron Johnson's been one of those absolutely awesome constants that you can just rely on down in, down out, year in, year out. And for me, it becomes like one of those Poyer Hyde conversations where I almost want them to be here past their prime just because I love the player so much and the person, underneath the pads. But that being said, you do have to always be looking to the long term. You do have to look at the fact that Taron Johnson hasn't been immune to missing time. We have safeties in Cole Bishop and Taylor Rapp that have both missed time. And I think this player comes in and can day one compete for kind of that depth spot, and I think has that SEC caliber, coming from a championship college, kind of knows what it takes to win and compete and stay on the field amidst a lot of competition. And I think day one in training camp, he is going to push Cam Lewis for a roster spot. Now, is he able to take that spot from him? I think that remains to be seen. But I think you have the upside to be able to compete there. The next pick in the 5th round, I think, is a 5th round home run of a pick. I think it's not going to be the sexiest pick. I don't think it's going to be the most jaw-dropping pick, the one that everybody's waiting to see what happens. But I think he's a super clean projection to the Bills. I think you know what you're going to get out of this guy. I think you know what to expect. And I think it gives us a lot of versatility in the tight end room. And that is the pick in Jackson Hawes. And dude's an absolute menace as a blocker. I think he provides you with blocking, special teams. You can slot him in day one as tight end 3. We saw the Bills let Quentin Morris, he's still floating around out there. So I think there's a good chance that they wanted to pursue this in the draft, and if they didn't get somebody they liked, Quentin Morris was going to be back on this roster. But I think you bring him in, his direct competition is Zach Davidson, and, more of a receiving profile for Zach Davidson. I think Jackson Hawes gives you exactly what you want to see in a tight end 3. I think there's a clear path for him for playing time. You think about, some of these jumbo sets where you want to lean into the run game, and we already do it a ton with that jumbo blocker in Alec Anderson. Maybe it'll be him this year, maybe a different role. But you can go 2 tight end sets with Jackson Hawes, Alec Anderson, and I mean it's essentially the way he is as a blocker. It's essentially 7 offensive linemen on the field. And I think this is part of a whole conversation that we're going to have maybe on next week's episode. But the lack of perceived significant moves at receiver, I think, is a little bit of the organization trying to be ahead of trends at the way the receiver position is going. And, the league, defense is kind of catching up to the passing games and teams kind of leaning back more into the run game. I think that is part of the plan here with the Bills, and just kind of thinking about having basically 7 offensive linemen blocking in the run game. I think super cool to think about. And then also, again, kind of like I talked about with, some of the injuries we've dealt with at cornerback and safety, and we haven't been immune to that at the tight end position either. Dalton Kincaid has missed time. Knox has missed time over the years. And I think that Dawson Knox kind of has that, above average ability in the passing and the blocking game. Dalton Kincaid is kind of that more of a receiving specialist. And I think if either one of them goes down, it's a pretty clean projection to, okay, Dawson Knox went down, Hawes is now our blocking tight end. Or Kincaid goes down, okay, we're going to kick Knox out to a more receiving profile, and again, Hawes can take over the blocking responsibilities. So I think it's a pretty clean projection to how he can get playing time on the field. The next pickup, Dorian Strong. This is another pick I love. Seen a ton of people way smarter than me having him as more of like a mid to late day or 3rd round pick guy. And I think this goes to right back to my conversation with all of the injuries that we've dealt with, and the cornerback room in particular being a room that we've dealt with a ton of injuries. So just like defensive tackle, this is another spot that I wanted to see the double dip. And defensive tackle, it was more for me feeling like we needed to restock the cabinet. We struggled to get that mix right for years. For cornerback, this was just more for kind of upgrading the floor and who is going to play snaps. Because when you look at the cornerback 3 position in Buffalo, they have played a ton of snaps over the years. And we saw this last year with Elam having to come in the game against the Chiefs. We saw it in previous playoff runs. We saw it with Trey White missing time. With a guy on the roster right now in Dane Jackson, and how much he played, how much he started in his time in Buffalo, and he was never on an opening game day roster as a preferred starter for the Bills. He's just gotten a ton of run with the Bills because injuries happen. He was the next guy up. So I think there's always kind of been room to upgrade that floor for, that CB3, CB4 role. And I think what you have now is just a ton of competition in the mix. And I think this is going to be super exciting to watch how it shakes out in training camp. You've added Dane Jackson, you added Trey White, and neither of them are on a contract that really precludes you from being able to cut them. I think Trey White is a really interesting one here because I think he would be a great guy in the room for these young corners to learn and grow with. I also think there's a chance Trey White, despite the pick of Max Hairston, could be your week 1 starter. And Max Hairston kind of takes over the duties as the season goes on. I think you also think about other guys in the mix. And Jamarcus Ingram, talked about Dane Jackson, Daquan Hardy as a pick last year. There's a lot of bodies in this room, and I think this is kind of my favorite part of this draft class in general, is you have added a lot of competition in areas that you've ended up struggling with at times. And, in the defensive tackle room, this isn't even really getting into Ogunjobi and the type of role Hoyt can have. You have in that defensive tackle and the cornerback room that were both kind of my 2 biggest perceived needs going into this, and defensive end being that 3rd need. You've made it where there's going to be difficult decisions to make on cut down day. I also love kind of the long-term projection of what kind of role you can expect for Dorian Strong. And, if he comes in and shows something, there's maybe it's not that clear path to being cornerback 3 in year 1, but you're talking Dane Jackson and Trey White, regardless of what their role ends up being this year, if there even is a role if they make the team, they're on 1-year deals. And you're going to already have a guy in the building for a year, learning the scheme, learning the culture, getting reps with this team. And it's not something that you go into next year with like, cool, we've really locked down, CB1 and CB2, but we're right back to dealing with depth. I think this is not only a draft class where you may have found your long-term answer for CB2, maybe could, in 3 years, the toughest decision you have at the position is how do you justify paying Benford and Hairston at the same time? But I think you also gave yourself a chance to really solidify the depth and possibly your competition to be a starter down the road. So I think awesome addition there. Kind of more of a high floor than high ceiling kind of player. And I think that's great to have as depth in the cornerback room. Rounding out the last 2 picks here, our other 6th-round pick, Chase Lunt. I think this guy is interesting. I also think that there could be a chance that this is another guy in long list of players that the Bills draft late in the draft and they get poached from the practice squad. And Chase Lunt, the story on him is he's another huge human being, like 6'7", and an athletic moving type guy. The interesting thing with him is kind of the story being that he doesn't really have the arm length to project well as an NFL tackle, and kind of that weird size build to be an interesting fit as an NFL guard. What I do like about this pick is you're kind of taking a flyer late in the draft that, give Aaron Cromer a guy every year and make sure the stables are being restocked for the guys protecting Josh Allen. And think you have interesting decisions coming up. David Edwards, Connor McGovern, are they being extended, or do you feel good about the depth that you have? if you're replacing them with depth after this season, you need the next level of depth to keep the system going. You have a decision coming up with Osiris Torrance, and these these guards aren't coming cheap right now. They're $20+ million a year for these top level guards, and I think Osiris Torrance is going to earn that contract, whether it's with the Bills or somewhere else. And the interesting thing is when you have this top end caliber roster and you're kind of spending to the cap every year, you're extending your guys, there's difficult decisions that need to be made along the way. And conversation to be had about whether that investment ends up being extending Torrance or not. We'll have that another day. But I think you give Cromer a guy to work with that has size and athleticism, and Cromer being a very highly regarded offensive line coach, I think you kind of give him a dart throw every year for a guy with traits, and you see what happens. And I think you saw that work out last year with Tylen Grable. And, as the season went on, he replaced Brian Vandemark as the incumbent swing tackle. And I don't think that's really a knock on Brian Vandemark. I think he still played well. I think it's more of the story of Tylen Grable and what he was able to do as a late round pick in getting coached up and how this whole room works together. So I think there's a chance that it ends up being, trying to think of all the names that have happened over the years. Nick Broker, Jack Anderson. There's another couple in there. I think he has a tough path to making this roster when you're talking about all 9 guys that the Bills rostered in the offensive line room last year, returning this year. I think we could also see this being a situation where we've seen in the past Brandon Beane kind of realizing the value of offensive line in this league. How many people aren't super psyched about their starting 5 and it being hard to find these starting caliber offensive linemen. And I think you could see somebody in this depth being flipped for a later round pick. And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe you swing for a little bit of a higher draft pick and maybe you see a David Edwards get moved, knowing that you're not going to be able to extend him and feeling comfortable with some of these guys' depth and being able to massage an extra spot and get something in return. I think it's less likely with McGovern. I think there's a good chance you see an extension there. But I think you might see something like that play out with one of these guys in maybe a David Edwards, maybe a Ryan Vandemark, maybe Alec Anderson. I think the Bills have done well to stock the cupboards here to give themselves options in whether they want to lean into a little bit more youth or if they want to, stick with what they have and make those decisions later down the road. And then rounding out the draft here, anybody looking for a receiver from this draft? Hey, you got it in the 7th round in Caden Prather. And I think this is another guy that has quite the uphill battle to be able to make this roster. I think even looking at it now, the competition that we have for the top 5, 6 spots, the Bills usually keeping 5. I think you have pretty stiff competition there. I think Prather is a guy that ends up on the practice squad. I don't think he has a huge projection to be able to contribute on special teams, and that ends up usually being a path to get one of these guys on the roster. I do think we're going to get to, rookie mini camps. We're going to get to, regular training camp and see him making some plays on, cornerback 4, cornerback 5. And I think we're, as a Bills organization, we always have one of these camp darlings, and I don't think he is going to be any different than that. Maybe something that can project a little bit further down the road, but I think he threw a dart at the receiver position, and you see what you end up getting there. You see what he can contribute, and maybe try to push for at least a practice squad spot, and you see what happens from there. But that's going to do it for the draft recap portion of the Wandering Buffalo podcast. Like I said, I have some interesting talking points that I want to get into in coming episodes. I have one particular thing that I'm feeling pretty passionate about. I'm having a hard time figuring out exactly how I want to vocalize it. I'm hoping that kind of wide receiver conversation will be my episode next week as I kind of work through the nuts and bolts of how I can properly communicate where my thoughts are with that. But I think that's going to be a super fun conversation. So make sure you're tuning in for every episode. If you haven't done so already, hit that like button, share the podcast, subscribe so you're not missing any of the episodes. If you've done any of those things or you're thinking about doing it, either way, I thank you for being here for this week's episode and spending some of your time with me when you could spend it doing anything else. Appreciate you tuning in. That's going to do it for this week's episode. We will see you next week. Until then, and as always, go Bills.